Kensington section of Philadelphia, an epicenter of the opioid crisis. Last year, more than 1,100 deaths, more than half from the synthetic opioid, fentanyl.
Sunshine, yo, you need Narcan too?
Yes, ma'am.
Roz Bichardo of Operation Save Our City carries Narcan to reverse opioid overdoses.
What we're doing right now as a city, it's not working.
How about Narcan, sister?
Yes. Give you 2 doses of that. You want the whole jar? Yeah. Oh, okay, here.
We first met Roz in March, before the pandemic.
Sunshine, get your water. You drop your water.
She had been fighting to open a safe injection site.
Are we all set? Everybody got something?
A safe space for drug users to inject, with medical staff on hand to reverse an overdose and save lives.
Does everybody have Narcan? I just have like the tidy whities.
Why is a safe injection site necessary?
Right now, you're finding people in alleyways, in abandoned lots, abandoned houses, in between cars. So if they used in a safe space, then 1, they're not dying. 2, they have an option to get services. And 3, you know, we got somebody who's looking out for them, who's not stigmatizing them, and who's not passing judgment. We're just simply trying to be there for them until they're ready.
A proposed site called Safe House was scheduled to open in March in South Philadelphia. It would have been the first in the country. But opposition to its opening was vocal.
They want a safe injection site, but they want to tax our soda and tell us soda no good for you. But illegal heroin, that is the answer. You can't buy a soda for $1, but I can buy a dime bag of heroin.
Locals living near the proposed safe injection site helped block the planned opening back in March.
I got a message again for
Anthony Giordano and the 12,000 members of his Stand Up South Philly group held a rally to celebrate.
Unite! Unite!
What is so upsetting to you about having this safe injection site here?
Safe injection sites, in our opinion, are not going to solve the problem of the opioid crisis. If this site was going to bring crime into our neighborhood, there was going to be drug dealers in our neighborhood, there was children walking around. This rally that we're having today, this victory celebration, I was told to stand down. I refused to stand down. We stood up, and that's just the way we are. We're here to make a difference. I'm on this side to close the sites down.
Oh, my God.
Don't you ever spit on me again.
Get off of me.
Someone call the cops.
Get off of me.
Someone call the cops. He just spit on me.
5 months later, Safe House is on hold, and the opioid crisis has only worsened in Kensington.
We want the powers that be to stop this containment strategy of leaving all the drugs and all the users in our neighborhood.
A federal judge granted a stay order against Safe House in June, citing the impact of the pandemic and civil unrest.
Dan joins me now. Dan, now are there plans to open safe injection sites anywhere else in Philly?
Hey, Savannah, good to be with you. The idea is to open more sites, but right now, as you saw, the plans to open the site in South Philadelphia are on hold. Now, in order to open any site, the federal judge in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania has to allow it to proceed. Now, the U.S. Attorney's Office has appealed, opposing the opening of any planned site, but organizers of Safe House, they're hopeful that since the court so far has said that it's legal, the question is timing. In June, the judge cited the pandemic and social unrest following the killing of George Floyd, and that the city's already on edge and that now is not the time. Now, the question of where to open any site like this is always a big one. Residents are often skeptical. There's this idea, not in my backyard. And ultimately, organizers want many sites across the city. Kensington section of Philadelphia, which we reported on, spent a lot of time reporting on, is one area that would really benefit from a site like this. But the idea is to share the burden and open these sites across the city so that people aren't going and congregating at one site, but that it's in many locations. Savannah?
Now, Dan, you touched on this, but take us a little bit more in depth on how the pandemic has impacted the opioid crisis there.
Yeah, so the pandemic has really exacerbated the opioid crisis further. What we've heard from users of drugs in Philadelphia and experts is that there's a contaminated supply of drugs now that's causing users to be sicker, and they're not sure exactly what they're getting. Overdose rates are up nationwide due to the pandemic, and that has the American Medical Association and advocates very concerned. Treatment options are more limited than ever, and of course, social distancing makes reversing overdoses harder. The use of Narcan and doing rescue breaths is obviously harder and not necessarily COVID safe. So people are dying alone on the streets and at home in high numbers, and they don't have to. That's the argument that safe injection site proponents are saying, is that if a site is to open, medical staff are there on hand in the event of an overdose to reverse that overdose and save lives.
Now, Dan, also just last question for you quickly. You might not know the answer to this, but do you know what happened to that man who spit on him in that video? I mean, you just watch and you wonder, were there any repercussions there?
Yeah, that was a pretty shocking moment just in the middle of the interview. You can just see how high the tensions are there. Initially, the police responded and did put him in handcuffs, put him in a police car, but very quickly he was released. It was determined that he would not ultimately face any time in jail for that, and they just released him. But it was a very tense moment, and it was kind of the beginning of our reporting for this documentary. That was the first interview, and that was one of the first things to happen.
Wow. Wow. All right, Dan, great reporting. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks. Good to be with you.
You can watch Dan's full story on The Report by NBC News. Just download the Quibi app on any mobile device.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.